Hei, folkens. Hjertelig velkommen til det foredraget med Neil Woods. Det var fint at vi klarte å konkurrere litt grann når vi har litt andre politiske kjendiser i resten av lokalet her. Jeg skal ikke bruke så lang tid på presentasjon. Neil Woods har skrevet denne boken her om sitt liv i politiet i narkotikakrigen i Storbritannia, som undercover agent. Så ja, folkens, Neil Woods.
Thanks, Trond. Thank you, everyone. I don't know what he said then, but I would imagine that he's just told you that I used to be a police officer, which I did. I was a police officer in the UK for 23 years. And 14 years of those, I worked undercover on drugs operations. Now, I didn't intend to do that when I started in the police at the tender age of 19. In fact, when I went into the police, I wasn't sure I wanted to do that in the first place. I dropped out of university, and I thought, what shall I do? I've got to get away from the scorn of my parents. So I thought, I'll go backpacking around Europe. And I was about to do that, but then I saw an advertisement in the newspaper, and it was an advert for recruiting for police. So I thought, well, what shall I do? So I flipped a coin, and it came up heads, so I went into the police. So I was literally flippant about it. But so when I was in the police, I thought it was going to be a great adventure, a boy's own adventure. And actually, I was a little naive because I really struggled with it. I struggled with the confrontation. I came from a fairly safe, middle-class-ish background. And so I was thrust into the inner city, and I struggled to keep on holding my job for the first 2 years, to be honest. But after 4 years, I managed to get an attachment to the drug squad. So this is in 1992, 1993. And everyone wanted to be on the drug squad. They were the people who had the biggest cars, the fastest cars, the most equipment, the most overtime. All of the detectives would go through CID and normal detective work. They all wanted to get onto the drug squad and do surveillance courses and drive the cars fast. And, and they looked cool. They did. So I don't know how I managed to get an attachment. But the drug squad hated us rookies. They really did. Because, someone there for a month, they don't know what they're doing. They just get under the feet. So, but after about 2 or 3 weeks, one of them perhaps saw something in me because he said, well, do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine? I thought, well, I've not been asked that before. And he said, well, here you go. Here's 20 quid. There's a door down there. It's a blue door. Just go down there and turn right. And knock on the door, see what you can do. So I did. I strolled down and knocked on the door. Had a short conversation with a pretty scary-looking geezer. And I came away with my £20 stone of crack cocaine. There you go. And that actually defined the next 14 years of my life. Because that kind of low-level undercover work hadn't been done in the UK before at all. The undercover work that had been done is a sort of pitched right at the top end, men in suits, that kind of thing. But this was around the time in the UK where we had a major moral panic about drugs going on, a major one. In fact, we'd had it for years and years before we'd even had any crack cocaine on the streets of the UK, because all our tabloid newspapers were running stories about how horrific how horrific crack cocaine was and how it destroyed communities. And all of the time, these stories would run in the tabloids saying, is it here yet? Is it here yet? And everyone was terrified even before it was there. So when it did hit the streets of UK, there was an enormous push from the government, because obviously the tabloid press and the public were so scared of this thing. The government made an enormous amount of money available to police forces with the instruction to do something about this terrifying new drug. Now, I'd gone into the police actually still remembering Nancy Reagan on the TV. Anyone else remember Nancy Reagan announcing that one smoke of crack cocaine and you're addicted for life? Yeah, you remember. That was in my mind when I went in the police. I actually believed that crap. So when I bought that first rock of crack cocaine, it was at the very beginning of an investment in new tactics and policing, sort of ramping up of the war on drugs, so to speak. But the first time I did it was actually quite easy because the gangsters didn't see it coming. They didn't know about this new tactic. But as soon as the gangsters go to prison, they tell each other what's going on, and they learn really, really quickly. So it quickly got more difficult. So it had to become more sophisticated, and it had to become constantly more sophisticated. Now, I would start by doing jobs for a few weeks at a time, and then that quickly went into sort of 6-7 months at a time. So I would be travelling around the UK, and the way the tactics developed is there was a special unit developed just for this kind of work. And if a police area wanted an undercover operation in an inner city, they would apply to this specialist unit, which is a sort of conglomeration of 5 police forces fed into it. And then they would supply me to them. But I would use a pseudonym while I was on the streets, but I would also use a pseudonym to the police officers as well. So they wouldn't know my real name, they wouldn't know where I was from, and they weren't allowed to ask. They were told they would be disciplined if they even asked me where I was from. That's the way it quickly developed to those kind of tactics. Now, earlier on, and sometimes I would play a sort of travelling criminal, a sort of general sort of thief, burglar, car thief, travelling dodgy type of bloke. I would wear me tracksuit and brand new trainers, sort of, that kind of thief. I don't know do you have scallies, those kind of people in Norway? I bet you don't, do you? Do you? Anyway, I pitched it at that to start with. But I quickly found that actually the most vicious gangsters, the people that the intelligence was about, and the people that we wanted to catch the most, who were dealing the heroin and crack cocaine in the inner cities, the way to get close to them was actually to really pitch it very low. So I would end up dressing really scruffily, like sort of virgin, looking homeless, looking like I sleep rough on the streets. Because it was the best way to network and get introductions to the people I wanted to get introduced to. And also because mingling with homeless people who had really serious problems with drugs, they were actually the most vulnerable people, which also made them the easiest to manipulate. So that's where the successes came. But I'll tell you, one of the tactics I used in terms of just dressing up, or dressing down, I should say, is at the end of the day, I would take my clothes off, tie them tight in a plastic bag, and then leave them somewhere warm. And it really made them hum. So the next day, I was really feeling in character. I suppose it's like method acting, isn't it, I suppose? But the rest of the team hated that, and so they were taking the mickey out of me all the time. I mean, police have pretty twisted senses of humour, and I didn't mind. So they'd drive me into an inner city, and they'd be winding the window down, and they'd be saying, "You smelly bastard," and they'd be just, taking the mickey. So one particular operation in Nottingham, and I was getting dropped off on the edge of an area to walk into the city and meet up with this gangster. I'd been buying weights of heroin off for a few weeks. And for some reason, this gangster was being driven around in a taxi. And I never figured out if he ever paid the taxi driver or just had something over him. I'm not sure. But anyway, he was in a taxi. But he still made me walk a mile to meet him. Anyway, the crew dropped me off, and they were winding the window down and calling me smelly, dirty, tramp, all of these kind of things. And they dropped me off. So you can imagine, I looked a mess. Anyway, they dropped me off just on the edge of the red light area in Nottingham. And I'm walking along this road, and I hear, "Sex for sale." I'm thinking, I know it's Nottingham, but that's quite forward for 1:30 in the afternoon. So I keep walking, and I hear again, "Sex for sale." And I keep on walking. It's a long curve in the road, so I can't see anyone yet. And I hear again, "Sex for sale." I keep walking, and then I see her. And as I'm walking towards her on the pavement, and I'm almost getting past her, and she looked me up and down, and she said, "Cheap sex for sale?" So, obviously, I'm sufficiently in character. So anyway, I walked past her, and I went to meet the gangster in the taxi, cursing him inwardly that he still made me walk, even though he's been driven round all day. But I went back at the end of the day. I did lots of stuff that day, and I went back and debriefed the team, the things that had happened in the day, and I told them about, the saying cheap sex, and they all laughed, the same as you. And then later on, I got involved in the development of undercover tactics, and I trained undercover cops all around the UK and cops wider in drugs training. And whenever I tell that story, everyone laughs. But that gangster who I bought the heroin off that day, I have no idea what he looks like. It's just another face in a sea of gangsters. I have no idea. But I can tell you, I can clearly see that woman's face. I can put myself there and I can see her absolutely clearly. Because she was not a day over 21, I would say. And she was clutching a can of Special Brew, just like ultra strong lager. And she was clutching it, desperately trying to fend off a heroin withdrawal. And she was really struggling. Well, obviously she was struggling because at 1:30 on a sunny afternoon in Nottingham, she was offering herself for cheap sex to pay for what she was requiring. And you generally find it's the same gangsters selling the heroin that actually exploit people like that. So she was being sexually exploited. And the reason that stays so clearly in my mind is because I was the agent of the state. And I walked right past her to go and do the state's bidding and go and buy heroin off yet another gangster. So I suppose that was one of the first things that stuck in my mind, that something's not quite right here. But I carried on going because, there's gangsters to catch, isn't there? So you keep working. In that same operation, I'll give you a bit of background about the operation. I don't know, you're probably not aware, you've probably heard of Nottingham, Robin Hood and all that, but actually the criminals in Nottingham generally much nastier than Robin Hood. And at that time, we had a gangster called Colin Gunn. He's lots of things on the internet about Colin Gunn. And he was having a war with another cartel. There was lots of shootings in Nottingham. So there was lots of pressure on me to find intelligence about the firearms offences and obviously the organisation that he was selling. So I was trying to get introduced to a particular lieutenant of his in a town on the edge of Nottingham called Mansfield. And so I needed to get someone to introduce me. Now, the guy I picked out was a guy called Cammy. Now, he was useful to me because he was on bail for dealing heroin, and he worked for that team. He was a user dealer. User dealers generally get exploited by organised crime. And Cammy was struggling. He was on bail, so he couldn't be dealing at that time, and he was really struggling. He'd got built up quite a big habit when he was a user dealer, and now got no income. But he was connected, so he was really useful to me. So what I did is I used to go shoplifting with them, with some of the other problematic heroin users, which I tell you what, is great fun, actually. Seriously, shoplifting is absolutely fabulous fun. If you're not going to get caught, and you can say, well, I always intended to give it back, put that in your evidence. It's brilliant fun, it really is. But anyway, I came one day to Cammy telling him I'd nicked a load of these baseball caps and I'd got one left. So I said, hey, you wear a baseball cap, have this one. And I'll never forget this day because he took this tatty old baseball cap off. He chucked it quite ceremoniously in the bin. And he put this new one on. He's looking in this shop window, look at his reflection. And he was so happy. So he was really useful, and he did introduce me to people. And I'll come back to that part of the story in a bit. But I'll just cut to the end of this operation because 6 months later, 6 months into the job, it came to an end. Very successful. Loads of gangsters arrested. Loads of drug users arrested and just caught up in it all. And Cammy was caught up because he was on bail and he was helping me score. But when he was interviewed, this was all on record when the officers interviewed him. It turned out he ended up on suicide watch. So he was a 24-hour watch in the police cells. And it's not because he was scared of going to prison. He did go to prison. He got sentenced to 3.5 years. But it's because, and as he explained to the officers interviewing him, he thought I was his one friend in the world. He literally thought I was the only person he could talk to. Which people should bear in mind and realise that undercover police work is the nuclear option of policing. It really is, because you cannot go into a community, a group of people, without having potentially enormous impact on people's lives. Because, we're good at manipulating people. That's why you end up doing undercover police work, because you can manipulate people. And you can make carnage. You really can, as the example of Cammy shows. So that when I was told that by the intelligence officer in that team weeks later, that really hit me. And I was about to start another undercover operation, but I thought I can't handle this. It's and I was still thinking about the woman who was selling sex in that day as well, and various other things. And I thought, I'm going to give this up. I've done this for a few years. But then only a week later, I got a phone call from the guy who handled me and handled the undercover operations. And he said, Woodsy, we need you for this job. You've got to do this job. We've had 2 undercover cops try to get into this team, and they're just seeing through it. They're not getting anywhere near. You've got to do this one, because these are even nastier than the last lot. Now, this was a team of people from Birmingham. And again, there's lots of things about these in the internet. They're called the Burger Bar Boys. And they're very, very notorious, sort of urban street gang, organised crime group from Birmingham. And they were taking over the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton. And as it was sold to me on the phone, they says, Woodsy, you've got to do this one, because these guys are using rape as part of their intimidation tactics. They're raping people for drug debts or girlfriends or sisters or anyone, and that's just part of their reign of terror. So I was talked into it. So I started another job in Northampton, and these were really difficult because they were connected to all sorts of cities around the UK. So I had to pick my mark really, really carefully. So after a couple of weeks, I decided I was going to work on this particular couple. Now, this couple, man and woman, they supported each other really, really well. They were both problematic heroin users. She was really good at selling the Big Issue. You have the Big Issue here, don't you? You know, the magazine that people sell to help homeless people. She was really good at selling the Big Issue, and he wasn't too bad at shoplifting. So that's how they'd spend the day, meet up later on, and they'd get what they needed, and till the next day. But they supported each other, and they were really good together. She was using heroin, self-medicating to cope with child sexual abuse, which is very common, incredibly common. In fact, in my experience, and as many drug workers will tell you, 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for either childhood physical or sexual abuse. 2/3. Lots of different people will tell you that. He was self-medicating for other reasons. He had constant pain in his hip, and he walked with a stick. But whatever their reasons, they looked after each other. So I won them over, because what I did is I made myself out to be a travelling criminal, and I needed the hookups for shifting stolen gear. So they knew everyone. So I'd go up to them and say, look, can you connect me with someone who can take my baby clothes off me? That's another tip for you, actually. If you are ever going to go shoplifting, baby clothes. People always want baby clothes. But, of course, you have to find the person who's going to buy them off you to sort of, to fence them. So I went to them, and I got connected to fencers for baby clothes, for electricals, for all different type of goods. But I'd start moaning to them and saying, look, I can only get 10 bags. I can only get crappy street bags of heroin. I need to connect for some decent weights. And eventually, he said, okay, look, I'll introduce you to the Birmingham crew. I'll introduce you to the burgers. And what he made me do is rehearse a cover story. He says, because there's no way I'm introducing you to them unless they think we've known each other for years. So he made me rehearse this cover story, which is really weird when you're running a cover story and someone's trying to teach you a cover story. It's really strange. And he was testing me as well, dates, people we'd known, stuff we'd done together. Tried way harder than I'd ever done. Anyway, but then he was terrified. He was absolutely terrified. When we went to meet them, they'd taken over this snooker club right in the centre of Northampton. It's like a really big snooker club with like 10 tables, and they just held court in there. So he was visibly shaking. He was visibly sweating. So we got there. He gave a nod to someone, and we were directed into the gents' toilets in this snooker club. There's just him and me in there, and he was literally shaking. And suddenly the door came open. This guy came in and opened the cubicle and stood on the toilet and looked over the top of the cubicle and said, "What's this?" A couple of seconds later, 4 hooded figures came in, just burst through the door and started walking in a circle around me. And then every so often, one would headbutt me on the side of the head, or they'd push me into another, and the other one would headbutt me back. And they just keep walking around like this. And all the time that they're doing this, I'm being asked questions by him up there. And he's asking him the same questions. And then he's testing and asking then he's rephrasing the questions, just trying to catch us out. And the sense of immediate violence was incredible. It really was like it was just going to erupt and they were just going to turn in on me. But after about 10, 15 minutes, eventually he said, "Yeah, okay, what do you want?" So relieved, I said 1 and 1, which meant a 0.4 of heroin, a 0.4 of crack cocaine. And then I'd got them. I was in then. There's a few hairy moments, but then I started gathering evidence of conspiracy against the team. So there was a core team of 6 and lots of different runners, and they had tendrils right across the city, really. I say there was a few moments. When you're gathering evidence against these people, you have to have some corroboration at some point. So you wear a wire or a camera or something, but you don't do that until you're absolutely convinced that they're happy with you. So this particular day, they looked at me suspiciously. And I just thought, am I imagining it? Am I getting paranoid? And so the next day, I was in 2 minds whether should I wear a wire, should I not? At the last minute, I decided not to, which is a really good move, because when I met up with them, they directed me to this park in the centre of Northampton called the Racecourse. And 5 of them stripped me at gunpoint. They said, "You're wearing a wire, you're a cop. You're heat man." And they stripped me daylight in the middle of a park. So I was really glad I'd decided not to wear a wire that day, to be honest. They were truly, truly vicious people. In fact, one day there was intelligence came in that they had gang raped someone in that car that I'd been getting into each day. And so there was a contingency plan. We didn't think that the woman would report it, but if she did, we needed to be ready for some corroborating evidence. So we had a plan that if I was going to get in that car, then I would have to get met by someone for the team, so that my clothes would become part of the scene. So I'd have to have the clothes bagged up and fresh clothes put on. So that was all set up. But of course, when I met them, they were in a different car. The car that they'd used, they set fire to on the edge of the city. So even though they terrified people into not talking to the police, they still took every precaution. Now, they didn't use drugs particularly. They were very businesslike in their brutality. But one day, when I came to the car and the car opened, there's this fog of cannabis smoke came out. It was incredible. It was like burning my eyes instantly. Anyway, I got in and they were so stoned. Now, oddly, I was using a pseudonym, almost like a double bluff sort of thing that was quite similar to my name. I was being called Woody. And this one day, this guy who was speaking to me, his name, I better not say his real name. I can't remember what we call him in the book. Anyway, this guy, he was implicated in 7 different murders in the Birmingham area. And this one day, he was stoned, and he looked at me and said, "Woody man, why they call you Woody man? Is it because you look like Woody Allen, man?" Thinking, really? So I said, well, no. And when you're working undercover, you tend to be quite quick thinking after a while of what you're going to say. And I just came up with this on the spot. I said, no. Well, you know the film Toy Story? And he went, "Oh, yeah. Obviously a Toy Story fan. I said, well, you know when Woody gets picked up and the naughty kid burns a hole in his head with a magnifying glass? He went, yeah. Well, when that film came out, I had skin cancer on my head, and I had to have it burnt out with laser surgery. Can you see the scar? And he went, "Oh, yeah." And I said, and all my mates took the piss out of me because of this. They were laughing at me because I'd had, and 7 times murderer gangster said to me, "Oh, man, that's so mean." Yeah, you just never can tell, can you, really? Toy Story fans. Anyway, the end of that operation, 6 or 7 months it was, and it was massively successful. I can say with absolute confidence, because I knew everyone by the end of it, I can say with complete confidence, I caught every drug dealer, every user dealer, everyone completely that was connected with the heroin and crack cocaine trade in Northampton. Every single person. 96 people were arrested. The bulk of the arrests were done at the start. A massive, massive operation. All the Burger Bar boys were locked up. And I spoke to the intel guy afterwards. I wanted to hear about the impact of it. And he says, "Yeah, we've just had some intel. This might make you laugh." He said, how long it was before someone could get some heroin and crack. It was as many as 2 hours. 2 hours it took before the new number was passed around and everyone knew the new number. And I know I got everybody. I know I did. I was on the streets. I heard the word. There were no other dealers. 2 hours it took. Again, that caused me a few doubts, that maybe things weren't quite right. And so again, I stopped working undercover. But then, again, I was tempted into it to work in Brighton. Now, Brighton, as you probably know, or you may know, is on the south coast of the UK. And at the time, it had the highest drug deaths per capita of anywhere in the UK. Now, seaside towns tend to have the highest drug deaths in the UK. And I've sometimes wondered if this is because, people are running away from something and the coast is just as far as they get and they can't go any further because the sea's there. But Brighton, it was even higher than the other seaside towns. Now, whereas travelling around the UK, I worked with lots of professional, really good police officers. The same cannot be said in Brighton, particularly. In fact, clearly not. They had been overusing the tactic in a very unimaginative fashion for a very long time. And the gangsters had got wise to it. They developed very specific defences against this kind of operation. And what they did is they used a homeless person. So you had an organised crime group coming from Liverpool, quite a long way, but it was a lucrative market. Another one from Birmingham, another one from London, at least one from London. And they would pick a homeless person and say, "You are now our proxy dealer. You will bring all the orders and all the money to us, and you don't bring anyone else, because if you do, you'll be killed. And no one's going to investigate it, no one's going to care, because you're just a dirty smackhead." Now, unfortunately, when I raised when I told the team this, their attitude was, well, if just another smackhead dies, the shoplifting will go down for a day. It's just another smackhead. What are you on about? Now, they didn't believe it, but they didn't care. Now, I can't say that there were casual murders going on. But what I can say is that the streets of Brighton, and when I say the streets, it's like wherever you go, there's the streets that most people see, and then there's the streets that you learn to look for, the sort of underbelly of any large town or city, anywhere, is there's more to it than you would think. And taking the pulse of that community in Brighton, they were all terrified, absolutely terrified. So many people there were completely convinced that there were casual murders going on. They all knew someone who they say they'd been murdered. And, you know, it was the highest drug deaths in the UK. It had been for over 7 years. So I'm not saying that there definitely were, because that would take a police investigation to say so. But what I'm saying is that several people, most people, believed that it was. And faced with the attitude of my colleagues and the casual view that a dead heroin user is no great problem, and faced with this sort of, it's almost a vision of the future that the organised crime groups had developed, this new tactic, this sort of almost an end game in the arms race. It made me realise, and I look back on all of the incremental thoughts I'd had, all of the doubts I'd had over the years, and finally the penny dropped. That the reason every single year my job got harder, every single year gangsters got nastier, they started raping people, they started breaking people's bones, it's because of me. Well, not just me, but people like me. And I have to take a certain amount of the responsibility because I helped develop the tactics with great enthusiasm. You know, I developed the expertise of this and trained people all over the UK to work undercover and do this. But I look back 14 years earlier, I just knocked on the door and had a quick chat. You know, the violence wasn't there. Not to the extent that it was later on. And the situation in Brighton, I mean, that's a vision of the future. That's what would happen if the police were using the same kind of tactics all over the UK in such unimaginative ways. So it made me realise that this is an arms race, this drugs war. It's an arms race with no chance of de-escalation. Because there can't be any peace treaty. There's no calling an end to it unless you declare peace, which means ending the war. But the reason I had to stop eventually in the job is because when I look back at people like Cammy or the couple in Northampton and so many other people that I manipulated, at the time I was manipulating them, I knew that would be putting them at further risk. Because when they go to prison or they go back out on the streets, everyone knows who it was that introduced the undercover cop to them. So that actually put them physically at risk. It also just made the lives of those vulnerable people less bearable, because Cammy wouldn't have got 3.5 years unless I'd walked into his life. And that guy needed help. But when I was making those decisions, I knew that. I knew I was making their lives more difficult. I knew I was putting them more at risk. And I was making the decision that the end justified the means. That was an operational policing decision in my mind, that the end justified the means, because catching the gangster, catching the bad guys at the end of the operation, to me, that made society safer. So the costs along the way were worth it. But when I realised, eventually in Brighton, the reality of the situation, that meant that the end never did justify the means, and that all I'd been doing is causing harm. I mean, if you think about it, that kind of decision-making, that's the decision-making of the battlefield. That's like a general deciding that some troops are going to die, but we'll win the war. And that's got no place in civil society at all. What other form of policing is there where you are actually willfully causing harm to a certain section of people just to get an end result? There's no other policing like that. But it took me 14 years to realise that. It took me a long time. But I realised it. Yeah, I realised it. I did. So, but I'm going to. So that's the principle. That's one of the most important reasons why I do what I do. But I'm going to return now. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Cammie's story, because there's another very important reason why the drug war really needs to end. One day, I think it probably about, I don't know, 6 weeks into the operation, and Cammie got arrested. And I'd spent a lot of time with Cammie. And he got arrested. I'm thinking, oh, he's on bail. We're not going to see him again. He'll be straight to prison on remand. But later that day, he came out. He was released. Now, I was stood with another 3 of his mates, and Cammie came over to us looking really sheepish. And I said, Cammie, what's up, man? What's going on? We didn't think to see you. We thought you'd be remanded by now. And he says, those bastards. Those bastards. He says, I was sat in my cell. They'd only got me on a little possession, but they knew they could remand me. Bastards came to me in my cell, 2 of them, 2 cops, plain clothes, and they said, you can either tell us about your supplier, you can either give us information, or we're going to tell everyone that you did do. I was quite shocked at this. But, so I said, what did you do? And he says, well, I couldn't tell them anything, could I? Because how do I know that one of them isn't working for the same person I work for? So I thought, I just have to refuse them and then just come out and tell everyone what's happened and try and hope that people believe me. And I'm thinking, well, I believe you. And they believe you. I'm just thinking, not quite sure his boss is going to believe him. So a few weeks after that, Cammie introduced me eventually to this lieutenant of Colin Gunn, who was a really crazy, vicious type. He turned up in this car after I'd got the introduction, and this was weird. Do you have like skinhead fashion here, like with the braces and the like bleached jeans and the check shirt and the skinhead? He turned up like looking like a skinhead. But the weird thing is, he's got a 12-year-old son who was in the same outfit and the skinhead. He's like a mini-me. Really weird. Anyway, he opened this car door and he beckoned me over and he got me in the sort of entrance of his car, and he got this blade out and stuck this blade into my bollocks. And you do not want to be feeling a sharp blade there. It's not comfortable, and that's an understatement. So he started asking me these questions and testing me, doing the same kind of thing, trying to catch me out. But what really put me off is I'm thinking, that's a 12-year-old child there. Thinking, what is this 12-year-old seeing? And that was the thing that was distracting me the most, to be honest. Well, no, was it? It might have been the knife. I don't know. But anyway, eventually, I must have passed his test, because then he sold to me. And I thought, I'm in, because he was my most important target in this job, and I'd got him on the hook then. Now, that operation, again, was massively successful. Loads of people caught, 90-odd people caught. The lieutenant was caught. And some of the information that I got from that operation led on to another operation, which eventually, about 12 months later, brought down the Colin Gunn Empire, which is a very, very big organised crime group. But just to rewind a little bit, I'm getting ahead of myself. The day after the guy had the knife pressed between my legs, the day after, with the team, we'd been working for about 4.5 months, and 2 of my team had gone off sick. So we had 2 new people come in that I'd not met before, and I was introduced to them in the morning. Met the first one, shook his hand, thought, yeah, fine. Shook the hand of the second one, and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. Instincts just on fire. And now, if you've been working undercover for a few months, your instincts are fairly finely tuned, perhaps to the point of paranoia. But he was just wrong. It was the way that he shiftedly looked to the floor. It just wasn't right. So I said to the boss, I said, look, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing today. I'm just not comfortable with it. So he said, fine, we'll exclude them both, so there's no questions, and we'll just tell them to park up at the edge of town. Just ignore them. So they didn't know what I was doing. Anyway, fast forwarding again, 12 months later, Colin Gunn's empire is brought down. And evidence is found that this particular police officer, who I'd taken a dislike to, turned out he was an employee of Colin Gunn. He'd been paid paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wage, plus bonuses for good information. And he'd been in the police for 7 years. He was employed as someone with no convictions, someone who's got the qualifications, who wouldn't bring any attention to himself. So, obviously, I had a big sense of relief that my instincts served me well again. But there was a debrief for that with some senior covert police in the UK. And the attitude from them was universally this. They said to me, Woodsy, of course this is going to happen. Because with this much money involved, how can it not happen? And that is universally the attitude of senior covert police in the UK, and more than likely everywhere. So I should emphasise that it is only the money from the illicit drugs market that can pay for that kind of corruption. There is no other kind of criminality can pay for that. And the reason for that is, well, apart from the fact that it's literally the biggest criminal market by a considerable way. In the UK, it's £7 billion a year, and that's the government's estimates. So it's probably significantly more. But £7 billion a year makes it an enormous business. But what the police do is we try really hard at catching people. And sometimes we do catch people. Colin Gunn was a fantastic success. You know, people who support the status quo will say, well, look at that operation. You caught the bad man. But we generally catch the low-hanging fruit. And whenever we catch someone like Colin Gunn, it just means that the next one is more careful. Because you can't reduce the demand. You can't change the market. You never reduce the market. You only change the shape of it. And what policing drugs over time does, especially when you try really hard and put lots of effort in, is you concentrate the wealth of that market in fewer hands. You make bigger cartels. And the gangsters know how to play the system as well. You'll find several of your police informants are actually people who have been told by gangsters to take out the opposition. So the gangsters use the system anyway. So over time, you get more monopoly. And that monopoly means the wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, which means they can afford £2,000 a month here, £2,000 a month here, there, or wherever, and they can infiltrate the police. So, which is why, I mean, they even said to me, Woodsy, well, this is why you use a pseudonym. This is why we don't let cops know who you are. As if that makes it all right. I mean, I used to give evidence behind a screen with a pseudonym, and no one could see me coming. I'd be driven to the Crown Court under a blanket, smuggled in through the judge's chambers. In fact, in an operation in Leicester, once, I even had a full counter-surveillance of 6 cars and a motorbike following me to make sure I wasn't followed because there was a credible threat in my life from that operation. Just people trying to find out who I was to get to me. You can only afford that kind of intense countermeasure by concentrating the wealth. So, apart from the fact that it's futile, you don't have any impact on the market. I mean, I put people in prison for over 1,000 years, way over 1,000 years, for the sake of interrupting the drug supply in any city for about 2 hours. That is the definition of futility. But futility would be bad enough. But it's not just futile. I was causing great harm to individuals, great harm to the communities, because the most successful gangsters are the ones who can be the most violent, who can most successfully intimidate communities. So it's not just that, but it's corrupting our entire system. This drug war is corrupting our institutions. And the harder we push, it the more corruption is caused because of the monopolizing effect. Now, some countries feel very smug. I mean, most people in the UK feel very smug in our stable democracy. We don't see this corruption. We're not honest about it. But we're on the thin end of the same wedge that Mexico's in, because 20 years ago, Mexico was fairly stable. Now it's complete narco state. You report a murder in Mexico and you are statistically more likely to be murdered for reporting the murder than you will have for actually having the murder detected, because it's less than 1% murder detection rate in Mexico. So that's the narco state. Now, it might sound melodramatic to say that's the direction we're going, and we may be many decades off that, but that is the direction we're going. And the harder you try to police drugs, the more you accelerate it, actually, because of the monopolizing effect. Now, I looking back on the harm that I caused to individuals, I ended up having PTSD. Now, over my time working undercover, I had samurai sword to my throat, obviously stripped at gunpoint, assaulted. So many times that someone tried to run me over with a car. So many times my life flashed before my eyes and I thought, this is it. So maybe that contributed to my PTSD eventually. But interestingly, my PTSD took the form that I sort of intense anxiety existing in singular memories. So that the sort of single memory dominated me so much that I couldn't really think of what was around me. And this would really persist. So that's how it manifested itself in me. But it's not the sword to my throat or the knife to my groin. It's not those memories that persisted with me. It's the memories of the woman in Nottingham who offered me cheap sex. It's the face of Cammy. It's the face of the couple in Northampton and many other people that really all of my time and resources would have been better spent helping rather than making lives far more difficult. Now, when I used to do that work, I felt duty-bound to take those kind of risks. I might have gone into the police quite flippantly, and I did, literally. But when I was there, I actually wanted to do the right thing. I grew up on sort of boys' own type of literature. It sort of shaped my character to do the right thing. So that's another thing that I struggled with, that my job was only causing harm. So I had to leave, and now I feel duty bound to share my experiences and explain this to people, because this is something that people don't know, and this is a side of policing. Again, people don't know that this goes on. People don't know that this is done in their name. I know you don't quite have this type of undercover work in Norway, but you do have parallels which cause the same problem. You have the use of police informants. Now, if a police informant is sat in a prison cell and he's thinking, I cannot do 5 years, I need to give some information so I get 3 years, he's thinking, who am I least scared of? It's the same effect. It creates a Darwinian, like an urban Darwinian soup, where it causes the gangsters, the most successful gangsters, are the scariest ones. So it doesn't matter what police tactics there are, the harder you try and do them, the more harm you'll cause. So this is why I travel wherever I'm invited, and so thank you so much to those organisations, and especially Trond, who's invited me. And this is now why I do what I do. So thank you very much for listening to me, and please support on social media or any way that you can the organisations that I'm in. Leap UK, I'm the chairman of, that's my main organisation. I'm also on the board of Leap in the USA, and soon I hope to be launching Leap Europe, which will be a catch-all for any police in any European country wants to take part. So thank you very much.
Vi tar nå 10 minutters pause frem til 7, så kan folk stikke og kjøpe noe å drikke og gjøre klarspørsmål. Så det blir spørsmålstime disse timene, ok? Så er det igjen om 10 minutter.
Break for drinks.
Ok, da starter vi snart igjen, så hvis det er noen som er utenfor, så kan dere bare, som har lyst til å få det med seg, så bare si ifra. Så ber dere komme inn.
Go on then, who's got a question for me? Oh, no, there's some people coming in. Got a question?
I actually have a lot of questions.
Have you?
Okay, the first one is, what's a scabby?
Oh, what, sorry?
A scabby. I didn't find it on
A
Google.
scally, yeah. I
Oh,
shouldn't have,
scally.
scally, I shouldn't have used colloquial English, really, should I? A scally is like a dodgy geezer.
Like a chav?
Like a chav with attitude. No, more of a chav who would steal his own mother's shoes.
Okay.
It's just, it would steal anything,
Yeah.
you know, that kind of thing.
And what did you do with the drugs he bought?
What did I do with the drugs I bought?
Yeah.
They went into tamper-proof, sealable evidence bags, and the serial number of the bag would be written down in the evidence, and all of the continuity of the evidence would be sort of quite sacrosanct. So there's quite a strict way of sealing it for evidence, really.
Like in Norway, we have registered SIM cards with our social security number.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So I know in the UK you don't. So how do you do surveillance on these types of people? I've heard that drug dealers in the UK have like 5-6 different SIMs with none of them registered.
Yeah, no. So you have to. So if you have a SIM card, you have to register it with your.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. I did not know that. God, that would have made policing quite a bit easier. But of course, there's always a way around any kind of sort of. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, yeah, they use SIM cards. The thing is, if you're changing numbers often enough, and you're using different numbers, and of course, if we did have that in the UK, there'd be a simple way around it, because you would just force various problematic drug users to use their numbers, which would put them even more in danger, because that would be the logical thing for a gangster to do. So, but no, they just swap numbers all the time, and the street grapevine was quick enough to sort of adapt to the changing numbers all the time. I mean, some dealers would use a SIM card, a different SIM card every day for 2 weeks, and you would know that would be the number. But then other gangsters would actually just give you a business card. Or, well, no, not gangsters, but they'd be sort of lower tier. There'd be people who didn't use drugs, but they'd be dealers. They'd be connected to the decent gangsters, and they'd give you like a cigarette lighter with their mobile phone number on, or other kind of sort of business cards, you know, that kind of thing.
But how did you, like, how would the police manage to, or do you not surveil the
Yeah, I mean, we did
phone?
surveillance with it, but you do it by data traffic analysis. So you would use software to feed in phone numbers into a program and work out who was calling who when. And then you would match that up to a database of police intelligence of who you believe using those phones. In certain circumstances, you could even use cell site analysis to say where that phone was at any one particular time. All of those kind of surveillance techniques. But the reason that undercover policing is used, according to our own legislation, legislation which regulates investigatory powers, you can only use undercover policing where conventional policing is ineffective or just can't be used at all. So even according to the legislation in the UK, undercover policing is the policing of last resort, because all of the sort of standard surveillance and investigation you can't catch these people with, because there's always countermeasures to it. So undercover policing is like the last ditch tactic, if that makes sense.
Did you ever have to use the drugs in front of the dealers to prove that you are a drug user? Like,
Never had to use heroin, though that would be terrifying, I have to say. Never had to use heroin. Never had to use crack, although actually that probably wouldn't scare me particularly. I had to use cannabis a few times, but what? It's just cannabis, isn't it? But once I was infiltrating these group of gangsters in this pub, and they were almost like cartoon-like. They were so outrageous in their criminality. This guy was stealing antiques. He had loads of stolen cars. I was arranging to buy stolen cars off him. Big weights of cocaine and all sorts of things. But as part of my cover story, I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines, which clearly I'm not. But he sort of was into this idea, and one day he brought me this present. He says, "Hey, I've got you this. You'll never have had any speed like this before." And he was right. He held up this see-through plastic bag with this toxic-looking pink goo in it. You could almost see it dissolving the bag in front of my eyes. It smelt like the urine from a glue-sniffing cat. It was disgusting. So he said, "Go on, have some of that." And I'm thinking, I really don't want some of that. But of course he saw my reticence. So I'd just seen him order someone else get a beating over a £10 debt. So I thought, this is not a good situation. So I thought, I'm going to have some of this. So I got my little finger in the bag and a little bit and dabbed it. And he says, "You want more than that? Go on, get a proper wedge." So I scooped a load in. Felt it burning my tongue. And it did instantly give me a mouth ulcer. And I felt it go down and the sort of warmth in my belly rising. And it didn't take me long before I was completely out of it. The street amphetamine at the time in the UK averaged 5% purity. This was 40%. It was really, really strong. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights. It was horrendous. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy. So yeah, not many times did I have to take drugs. I normally managed to talk my way out of it. And quite often, certainly when you're buying heroin, actually the gangsters want to trade in a place where it would make it quite difficult for them to say, "I want to see you doing it." So, there's a few scary moments, but no, thankfully I never had to do any heroin.
I just assumed like friends share if you have these contacts and stuff, that like that guy who went to jail for 3 years.
Yeah, but when you've scored and you've got it, you want to use it, and people use it in their own way, in their own place.
Oh.
So it's quite normal for me to say, "I'm going now. I do my drugs in my space where I do them," and that's quite normal. It's quite reasonable.
If you didn't catch, okay, this is kind of stupid, but if you didn't catch the gangsters, did they basically earn off the undercover cops? If you just kept buying and you never caught them, have they basically gotten money from the police enforcement?
Yeah, I have no idea how much money I've given organised crime over the years. Yeah, I suppose so. If you haven't caught them, yeah, you're just giving them some more business. Yeah.
So you're in a way like promoting the business more by.
Well,
making
yeah,
demand.
but it's only a tiny part of it. Tiny part, because the business is huge. But yeah, I mean, I've paid enormous amounts of money over the years. Interesting. I might have to think how much I've spent one day, actually.
And what was the coolest thing you shoplifted?
Oh, right. Well, it wasn't very cool, but I was really proud of it because it was 6 DVDs. Now, 6 DVDs, if you think about it, it's quite a large space, isn't it? It's quite a bulk, and I wasn't that experienced a shoplifter, so I was really happy to be able to get that much under my jacket. 6 DVDs, kudos. But coolest thing, I don't know. You used to get this was cool. The PlayStations, you used to get extra memory for PlayStations, and you used to buy them in a packet. But wherever you got them in an electrical shop, you would have like a magnetic strip which would set the security off. So it's a really cool thing to be able to do, to peel the magnetic strip off with no one seeing. So I used to do it like that. I used to think, yeah, I've made it.
Could you help, or do you wish you could help your friends who were criminals get a smaller sentence? Like, did you have any influence with
I
it?
didn't have any influence at all. I mean, for some of the operations, I discussed it with the senior investigating officer, and sometimes I would be reassured that the police would put in the file the circumstances and that they wouldn't be seeking a prison sentence. And quite often the team that I work with would be disappointed or annoyed that the courts just ignored all of that thing. I mean, with some operations, you'd have a really nasty dealer getting the same amount as someone who was a user dealer. And that didn't make any sense. And actually, there are European Court of Human Rights rulings on that, stating that there should be lesser sentences for people who are selling drugs only to pay for their own habit. But that gets breached all the time, and it did get breached. But no, I had no influence of that at all.
Were you worried about repercussions? Like, aren't you worried now that they might come back, like, to get you and stuff?
You know, that's the question. That's the favourite question from journalists when I do events, actually. In fact, it's always the first one from a journalist. Because, yeah, as I said, I used to go to Crown Court behind a pseudonym. No one would ever know my real name or where I was from. And now I'm using my real name, and here I am. I live in Herefordshire in the UK. So I give two answers to this. The first answer is I took a risk to do what I believed in then, so it only seems reasonable to take a risk to do what I believe in now. But having said that, I'm not particularly worried, because I have described some really brutal people, and there are really brutal people in the illicit drugs trade. But you have to remember that's just part of the business model. They're only being violent because it protects their business and because the violence makes them the most successful trader in the game. It's an unregulated market, so monopolies appear. Any unregulated market, that's the case, but these people try and grow their business by the use of violence. So yeah, they might have wanted to get rid of me before I'd given evidence, but now, years later, it's not in the interests of any of those gangsters to come after me for revenge. Because where's the advantage in that? Where does that fit in the business model? Yeah. But actually, if people start listening to me en masse, and there's suddenly an enormous social movement grows, and everyone's like saying it's because I'm following the words of Neil Woods, then I'll start watching my back. Yeah, because then there'll be hit jobs on me, I'm sure. But I think we're a few years away from that. And it wouldn't be just down to me anyway. But yeah, I mean, the comparison I make is, as a conventional detective, I once caught a guy who was a member of an extreme right-wing group called Combat 18. The 18 stands for 1 and 8, A and H, Adolf Hitler's initials. Yeah, total psychopath. And now, what I arrested him for was a series of criminal damage and firebomb attacks on Chinese takeaways. He really hated Chinese takeaways. And he even ranted about, Great Britain fish and chip shops and things. But he was a complete psycho. Now, he took great exception to me being a liberal cop. Absolutely hated me. Wrote letters to me from prison. He absolutely hated. He said he was going to kill me one day. Now, I would consider him more likely to come after me than any of the gangsters I put in prison, because they're just businessmen. He was a nutter.
Okay, you said it was getting more violent, and Brighton indicated the future. I didn't really understand how the police made it that way. How did that connect?
Well, in the rest of the UK, the tactic was used quite carefully, or as carefully as it could be done, so that it would only be done occasionally. It would be done with a constantly developing tactics, so you would not purport to be the same person. I would do a job where, so the next job I did, I'd be selling stolen electrical goods out of the back of a van, or those kind of things, just to mix it up a bit so that people are not used to it. In Brighton, they were using just the same tactics in really unimaginative, boring ways. So the gangsters were just really savvy to it. And so that sort of showed a sort of fast forward of the future where gangsters are savvy to all tactics, if that makes sense. So it was like a fast forwarding of how violent those gangsters could be in response to the police tactics.
Oh, so both sides become more violent eventually, or more.
Yeah, I mean, the police will always get smarter, the police with tactics, always. Police are really good, really good at developing tactics. They are brilliant at investigating this stuff, they really are. But the problem is, the pushback is much simpler from organised crime. It's become more violent.
What do you think about the war on drugs in the UK compared to the US? Like, do you think it's similar? Have you looked into that?
Well, I mean, the United States gave us this war on drugs in the first place, and forced their morality, their moral judgment on the rest of the world. We're all subject to American imperialism in terms of drug policy. So they do have a situation much worse than us. The violence is much worse. There's an interesting statistic, actually, of just how much worse it is in the United States compared with a place like the UK or many European countries. In 1969, the United States had a murder detection rate of 85%. In Norway, it's 90% at the moment. In the UK, we have about 85%. When Nixon declared the renewed war on drugs, within about 4 years after that, the murder detection rate in the United States had dropped to 65%. 65. It's never climbed above 65% since Nixon declared the war on drugs in the United States. And that's during a period of time of incredible developments in forensic science, DNA, improved fingerprint techniques, and various other types of forensic science that lots of police forces make use of. In the United States, it stayed that low. So, yeah, every single country that pursues the war on drugs will have an increase in violence. The United States have got it on a whole new level. They really have.
What's the detection rate in the UK?
It's about 85%. So it's dipped a little bit below that, but we don't have the guns to the same level as the United States, so that makes a difference. But that's an indicator that it will fall as gangs get more powerful and as gangs fight with each other. You know, it may be a few years off in places as calm and stable as Norway, but it will happen, in my view.
And you said there was this undercover criminal. Oh, sorry. I only have 3 more questions.
I'll tell you what, should we take 2 more other questions,
Yeah,
and then one of yours, and I'll try and answer all 3 together. Then we'll get more people with questions. But we will come back to you, honestly. We'll get all questions done.
Hi. Thank you for the good talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about this organization that you lead now, and obviously this doesn't work in your opinion. So what's the alternative? What do you do differently?
Should we take another question as well, and then I'll answer the 2 together, if that's all right? Anyone else? There on the front.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. When you're now speaking out against the current drug policies of the Western world, do you receive any social stigma from anywhere? Close social relatives or outside?
Good question. So the first question, well, what do we advocate? Well, LEAP advocates the regulation of all drugs to take the power away from organised crime and to make our communities safer. Only by regulating drugs can you be sure what's in them. Only by regulating drugs can you take the power away from organised crime and end the cycle of corruption and violence. Drug policy should be about saving lives and reducing harm. And current policy only causes harm. So the trouble is, people hear this word legalization and it scares them. They think, oh, it's a free-for-all, it'll be chaos. But actually, no, drugs can be dangerous, so we should get them under control. What we're talking about is control, not chaos. So what you do, if we talk to politicians about these things, is we break them down into small policy chunks. It makes it achievable, because every drug has its own regulatory requirements. Alcohol has particularly specific regulatory requirements, which you do so very well in Norway. Heroin would be the easiest one to regulate because you prescribe heroin to those people who are having problems with heroin, because then you save them from the manipulation of organised crime. It sounds simple. It is that simple. You have a medical model. Only people who need it medically, you provide it for them. The evidence is there from the British system before the Americans corrupted it, and from Switzerland, who actually use British evidence to inform their policy. They prescribe heroin only to the most problematic users, but as a result of doing that, they've reduced their crime massively, burglaries. They don't have shoplifting. They've virtually eliminated street prostitution by prescribing heroin. I can see no reason why any government would not do that at all. So that's simple, because a medical model actually stops it expanding. It takes the market away, because gangsters actually want user dealers to find new customers. Doctors prescribing to someone who needs the heroin, they are under no pressure at all to find new customers. I mean, in the UK, I can only use the UK stats, but we had 1,400 heroin users before the American style of prohibiting heroin, because we used to prescribe it. 20 years later, we had 400,000 users, problematic users, 400,000. Prohibition did that. So heroin's easy. It's the simple model to use. On the other end of the spectrum, if you look at cannabis, in the UK, less than 1% of teenagers can buy alcohol because our regulation works really well. You need to provide photographic ID. It's quite straightforward. Over 50% of teenagers in the UK have easy access to cannabis. And in some inner city areas, it's as high as 90%. Now, I do read that some people say that in Norway, those percentages may be less. But they'll still be too high, because we should be protecting our children from the drug. We really should. We do not want our young developing brains using cannabis. So we should be protecting our young from it in the same way that we do from alcohol. But also, we should be protecting them from organised crime, because I have seen that organised crime recruit their dealers through the teenage cannabis market. They lay on a weight of cannabis. They'll say, there you go, there's half an ounce, sell that as 14 individual grams, and then bring me the money back when you're finished. So you've got a teenager who's got the kudos of having the best cannabis around. He's got some spending money, easy spending money, and they're the coolest person in their group. And that's how organised crime recruit. That's where the gangsters of tomorrow come from. There's a young man I saw in Leicester. He was about 17. He went by the rather unimaginative nickname of AB. And when I first met him, he'd just started dealing heroin and crack. Previously, he'd just been dealing cannabis. He got into it as a teenager. Now, when I met him, he was quite a cheeky young man, quite likeable, really. 6 months later, he was terrifying. He was a terrifying 18-year-old. Because he'd got into that scene, and to become part of that team, where the team's not caught, because they have to be the scariest team, he had to learn to become violent. And he was horrible over the space of 6 months. Now, when he was 16, I'm sure he didn't think in 2 years' time, I'm going to be intimidating heroin users by making them crawl on the floor for the drugs and be violent just to build a reputation. I'm sure of it. It was the marketplace which shaped his personality. And we should be protecting our young from that influence. You can only do that by regulating. So all the drugs in between, yeah, you have to be really careful. You have to be very careful in how you regulate things. Take great care. But even a poorly regulated system is better from gangsters controlling the supply and putting in what they think they should put in the drugs. And sorry, the second question. Did I get any stigma? Yeah, well, when I left the police, when I first started speaking, I recovered from PTSD, and I first started speaking out. And actually, I recovered by finding the sense of purpose, but actually speaking, because I think speaking about it and doing something about it, it was doing something positive, and that's what brought me out of it. But when I first started speaking out, I was absolutely ostracized. Any colleagues that knew me were told not to have anything to do with me. And in fact, I had a really close friend in the police, and she was called into her boss's office and said, "You are being given a lawful order that you must not speak again to Neil Woods. You must delete him from your phone, delete him from social media right now, and you must not speak to him again. This is a lawful order," which means she would have been disciplined if she'd gone against that. You know, and I miss my friend. So yeah, there was a lot of stigma, and I was ostracized by the police. Since I've published the book, it's been incredible. There's so many people that I knew and lots of police that I didn't know. I've had overwhelming support, incredible amount of support on social media. And personally, you know, and we've had lots of people join Leap UK, which is wonderful. It really is. So yeah, there was a period of time when there was lots of stigma. But things are changing really rapidly in the UK. 5 years ago, you'd have been considered completely weird for saying the things that I'm saying, and people wouldn't listen. But people are increasingly listening, and things are changing rapidly, I think. Not necessarily with mainstream politics, but with the people who matter, voters, people like you. Because, you know, if you do agree, then you're part of the social movement. Because we all need to take responsibility for this, because this is great harm that's been done to our society. So if we are in agreement with this, then we should do what we can, even if that's only activity on social media, persuading other people, engaging in the debate. Does that answer? Anyone else want a question, or shall we return to?
Thank you. I was wondering, at what level does one in a police career get exposed for corruption, and at what level or what period in a career is this possible? And what do you think about, especially in the UK, at how high levels does this corruption go when it comes to, just inside the police?
Great question. Should we take the question in front as well, and I'll answer them at the same time?
Yeah, I just wondered what police officers say to themselves to make it the drug policy be so much more prestige than the other fields, because you're running around like in the street catching the small guy who is ill. To the public sounds not so prestigeful. How does the police make it become prestige? That's what I wonder.
Okay, another great question. Well, how high does corruption go? Well, that is a really good question, isn't it? I mean, to think if someone's been in the police 7 years and we accept that this is going on, then no, we have no idea, do we? Really? But I'll give you an example of where it makes someone untouchable. There's a gangster, quite an infamous gangster in South Manchester, South Manchester, Reddish, Stockport, that kind of thing. He's a very, very significant figure. He's been acquitted of 3 different murders. First murder, he killed his rival to take over his empire. Second murder, he quite publicly executed someone he believed to be an informant by making him drink petrol, taunted him, and put him in the boot of a car and set fire to the car. He did that. He made sure he had witnesses so that everyone was terrified of him. But of course, no one's going to give evidence. And the third time, a rival gangster was found dead in his bathroom with multiple stab wounds. And the body was found in his bathroom, and he still got off at Crown Court. Still got acquitted. Now, just before I left the police, I was ground cover detective sergeant, so I was responsible for the sort of north of Derbyshire, sort of normal detective work. And I got a call that Greater Manchester Police, so the neighbouring police force, very close to us, had executed a search warrant for a cannabis factory in the sleepy, very wealthy village of Hayfield. So I turned up, and there's loads of Greater Manchester cops there. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? It's only a cannabis grow, for goodness sake. So I went up to this sergeant and says, well, why don't you call ahead? I could have, you're going to be giving us this crime to investigate anyway. Why don't you get us, some of us here, and we could have helped you and made it easier for you. He says, oh no, we're under strict orders. We don't tell anyone what we're doing. And I worked out there's 12 of them. And he explained to me that they were a special unit set up in Manchester. Now, you've probably got an idea of how big Manchester is, but it's the third or fourth biggest police force in the UK. It's massive, several thousand cops. And he said, no, we've been handpicked by the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. A handpicked unit, all of our backgrounds have been looked at, and we only report directly to the Chief Constable. And we've been tasked with taking down the empire of this particular gangster. Aaron Coughlin, his name is. You can look him up, Aaron Coughlin. And I was gobsmacked by this. So basically, he was told that we're attacking any asset which we believe is connected to him. So if we have any intelligence that there's an asset like a cannabis factory or anything else, then we're going to go at that and just keep attacking his empire. So I said to him, so you are the untouchables then? And he says, yeah, that's right, but apparently we're not allowed to call ourselves that. But if you think about it, that's 12 cops in a police force of several thousand. I think Greater Manchester's about 7,000 cops or something. The Chief Constable can only trust those 12. So, yeah, how far does it go? It's a good question. I'm sorry, I can't answer it any better than that. It just, it's always going to, I suspect it'll always be further than we think. So, so how does policing drugs become so respected? Well, in the 90s, it was respected because all the money was thrown at it. And they had all the overtime. And because they had the best training courses, they had the best equipment, they had the best cars, and being trained to do surveillance driving is quite a great thing. And they seem to have all the fun. So that's why, really. But it's actually changed drastically in the UK. It's changed massively. Policing drugs is no longer a priority for police and crime commissioners who set the priorities in virtually every police force in the UK. So things have changed really drastically. And we have got some wonderful police and crime commissioners, in particular in Durham, another one in North Wales, Arfon Jones, who is actually a member of Leap UK. He's a serving police and crime commissioner. And they have said that, no, we will not prioritise. And in places like Durham, they have actually publicly gone to the newspapers and said, we are instructing our police no longer to pursue people for possession of cannabis. We will no longer pursue people for growing cannabis in their own home. And they've said that, and they got an enormous amount of backlash from the right-wing press, but they've just stuck at it. And interestingly, in County Durham, as a result, 12 months after that, they announced that policy, they are the only police force in the UK that have been measured outstanding by all measures by the Inspectorate of Constabularies. So things are changing, and it hasn't got the same kudos anymore. In fact, most police forces don't have a specialist drug squad anymore. They don't even have one in the UK, which is fantastic, major steps in the right direction, I would say. Sorry, just wait for the microphone.
Here in Bergen, they have closed a so-called open drug scene, and a report have come out afterwards, and it says that the police have done very different policing in the city center, and now over by a new health care and a low threshold center for injecting drug addicts. So the police have, in the report, got a very good reputation for what they do now, where they leave people alone, more or less. And what they did in the city center, most police in the report said they didn't believe it was a good method to give a lot of high tickets and to expel people for 24 hours or 48 hours. So in the report, the police on the ground say they don't find it a good method to give these tickets. And afterward, the general opinion about the policing over there at the Strakshuset, where they do not interfere as much, seem to be good. They are more like social workers. And it's been a change in the roles of the social workers and the police, where they mix more what they do, and that is at the moment giving people, making people a little bit confused. But we will see how it goes.
Well, yeah, I mean, if police are even talking about harm reduction, and if they are even talking about more positive approaches, even when they don't, even at the point when they're not functioning properly yet, it's still a massive step in the right direction. And I think that's social change. If police are even starting talking about that, so I find that really positive. Those kind of things are just got to be encouraged all around. And if police tweet here, we've got police get really involved in social media and in the UK, and so a lot of us reformers, we will pester police on issues like that, and we will praise anything that's positive. Just those kind of things really help, you know. Because a lot of people who are not interested in reform follow police Twitter accounts because they're sort of traditional police supporters who would support anything the police do. If you get those voices in there, it can't hurt. I think any kind of interaction on social media with police is a good thing on drugs. Any other questions? You have two more, I believe. Anyone else? No. One more there, then we'll come to a question.
I'm just
here.
popping back to the corruption bit because I was just thinking you became a cop by chance or it was not your childhood dream. So before you became an undercover cop, would it ever be as a low-paid or a low-grade cop an option for you to be corrupted? Would the organized crime in the UK recruit cops at an early stage, or would they make and take their picks like you do, make their marks and find the key person they need to take the bribe? I think the example you gave, £2,000 to £3,000, it's not that much to sell your dignity or pride in your work.
No, I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I never would have been tempted, but just as a matter of interest, I didn't actually get paid any more for undercover work. I was the same pay grade. I was a constable, so it wasn't any different. I got more overtime, but that was exhausting as well. So, no, I mean, I wouldn't have done, and I know, and I am very certain I know I never would have been tempted by that. Some might do, you know, that's the traditional way of corrupting police, you know, corrupting them by sort of one-off payments is quite a traditional way of corrupting police officers. And in the world of illicit drugs, that still goes on. There is plenty of traditional corruption in the police. There's a really good local newspaper in the UK called the Liverpool Echo. They cover local crime issues just really, really well, better than most local newspapers. And it seems almost so often I read in the Liverpool Echo they've got a court case of a police officer who's been paid money by Liverpool gangsters about drugs. So that kind of traditional thing does go on. But it's part of the arms race, again, that police like that get caught. So the way around that is to employ someone to join the police. So you're not corrupting someone's ethics, and you're not catching them out with a gambling debt or manipulating them because they're susceptible to it. You've employed them to actually be a spy and join the operation. That means they're not likely to get caught. Now, the one that got caught that I came across that infiltrated my team, that was just good fortune that he was caught. And a little bit of clumsiness on the part of Colin Gunn, and there's a lot of gangsters won't be clumsy. So those spies from organised crime are in the ranks. We know it, and we're likely possibly never to know who they are.
Actually, the question did relate to that guy. I was kind of confused about if you were standing there and you saw he was being a bit like nervous, couldn't he see that you were a policeman as well? Like, how did he not point you out?
Oh, you mean the undercover gangster, the one who joined, who I took exception to? Well, he basically, the structure of the team was, I would have 2 people as backup. I would have an intel guy who would record all of my intel and read out the relevant intelligence of the day at the start of the operation. I would have a technical equipment guy who would take my technical evidence and document it. I would have like people doing statement reading. I'd have all this team around me. So when I came to deliver my evidence, they would record it and process it. And so that team was necessary to collect all the evidence. Now, 2 of the team, the backup people, weren't able to be there. So he was just replacing those. So he knew I was a cop, but he just didn't know my real name. And he didn't know what I was up to because he was new to the team. He hadn't been there the day before.
Oh, he never saw your face?
No. Well, no, he saw my face.
No, but in the criminal scene, he never saw you
No.
or met with you? Okay.
No. So he didn't know where I was actually being deployed and who I was having business with. Now, he would have been able to report back that there was an operation of some kind going on, but he wouldn't have known who the targets were and what was going on. So he probably managed to warn his gangster mates that, hey, watch out, there's something going on. But nothing more than that. But of course, if he'd been in there in the briefing, he would have known exactly who my targets were, exactly who I intended meeting that day, how much heroin I intended to buy, what phone numbers I was going to use, what my phone number was. He would have known all of these kind of things, which, considering in the few weeks up until that point, Colin Gunn was actually letting everybody know that if he ever caught an undercover cop, he'd be tortured to death. And he was letting everybody know that. And that was the intelligence that we were getting all the time. So I was quite pleased that I sussed him out.
Okay, this is a side question, but you know how Google can record from your phone just with Google Now and stuff? Like, do you have to wear a wire? Couldn't they just put some software on your phone and you could just keep it there and record constantly? Like
Sometimes I use the smartphone, which is technology where it's an open mic, so someone can hear what's going on all the time. But the quality wasn't very good at the time, and also it had to be a different phone, so I had to walk around with 2 phones. Suspicious. So I didn't use that very often, and the equipment had to be of a particular quality, and that we could prove to be so as well, so it had to be tamper-proof. And so I would imagine that an open device utilising the internet, it would be very difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt to a court that that was not tampered with. So, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm out of date. There's going to be much more technology now, but I would imagine using the internet would be quite difficult because you wouldn't be able to prove it.
All right, and like, does the government and the politicians, do they use your findings to like reevaluate the war on drugs? Like, do they actually?
I wish they would. I have spoken to some politicians. I've met with them. At Leap UK, we advocate where whoever will listen to us, and we do have some really, really good supporters, particularly in the Scottish National Party, in Plaid Cymru, which is the Welsh Nationalist Party. We've got some supporters in every political party. The Lib Dems are very good. They've got in their manifesto they intend to regulate cannabis use for adult use. So yeah, we do have lots of political allies, but no, government would not. The controlling government would not listen to what I've got to say as evidence now. I look forward to the day when they do.
You said 2/3 are usually victims of abuse or rape or sexual abuse, all that stuff, of these like drug dealers. Do you think if the same resources and money spent on the war on drugs was spent protecting these people when they were children and like helping the victims if they did go through it, would prevent like the drug use? Do you think that would be a more efficient way of solving the problem?
That might be the most important point that's been made all night, actually, because policing drugs, it's the biggest policing bill. There's more spent on drugs investigations than anything else. It's enormous. It's £7 billion a year in the UK. It'll be the biggest policing bill in Norway as well. I was speaking to Bård in Oslo yesterday, and he was saying it's probably over 50% to his estimate of the policing bill. 5 billion. See, that's 5 billion kroners is the estimate. So that's an enormous amount of money. Now, that money could be invested in services to help people who are dealing with childhood trauma. It could be used to deal with people who need some kind of drug treatment services. There's more than enough money in there to solve the problem by other means. You're never going to solve it completely, but you'll do a significantly better job than criminalising people and wasting all of these resources on policing. So yeah, and failing to look after those people is adding to the problem. The drug problem is the fact that we ignore those problems. And it's only heroin use where that I've got that statistic for 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for childhood abuse. But people who have a problematic relationship with drugs generally have some other issue that they need to deal with, whatever the drug is. Even according to United Nations figures, 90% of people who use drugs do so without any problem at all with the drug. No problem at all. So to have this enormous punitive drug policy to punish those 10% that do is to me, the definition of insanity. So yeah, the money could be spent much better elsewhere. And we have a question at the front.
Isn't part of the problem that if you could have gone to the chemist to get your bag of happiness, that would be great. But as a buyer, you are per definition entering a criminal environment. So it's kind of self-recruiting. And so by the criminalization, and you would solve the problem very easily. But how can you sell that argument? You say that the Lib Dems and some of the national parties are progressive, but you still have Labour instead of the Conservatives to work with, and that's quite, I would think, high threshold to pass.
Yeah, it is. It is very difficult, and unfortunately, we have a far less progressive political system than you do here in the UK. We have a ridiculous voting system which lumbers us with essentially a two-party system. But having said that, it's from the most recent election we have had a handful of new Labour MPs who have already spoken out for reform. And we have, for a while, we've had some allies in the Conservative Party as well, some really good allies, some socially liberal Conservatives. But they're not the most important people. The most important people is the voters. And politicians are only going to really publicly change their mind, even those who privately agree with us, if they feel that they're going to get public support. So actually, the social movement is more important than the advocacy to politicians. And that's what I say to every audience wherever I speak. Please get involved and persuade who you can, because the social movement starts here. It really does, because politicians will not change their mind unless the polling says that it's a salient issue for voters. But you're right about decriminalising, but I would always go farther than decriminalising. We need to regulate the market, and then we know what's in the drugs. Then we take the power away from criminals.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for a very interesting speech and food for thoughts. I am the local director of prosecution in this region of Norway, and these thoughts I will take back to my office and we will discuss them. I have spent probably most of my life fighting drugs, and I'm responsible for the priorities for the police here. And there is change going on. We are not anymore, I would dare to say, chase the users in the streets as we used to, and we did used to do that.
Mm.
There is still a priority against the organized crime selling drugs, and I believe that will go on for quite some time. And we find that these organizations responsible for the massive sale of drugs are also responsible for a lot of other criminal things.
Mm.
And it's perhaps a question of the hen and the egg, what's first and last, but regulating one of these markets, having all the others open, and finding that also the other markets are full of problems and money, it's a limit to what we can regulate. There is trafficking in human beings behind all this. There is illegal gun sales behind all this. And at some point we'll have to take a stand and take the fight. So how do you intend to regulate this so that these organizations stop making money from all the other things they're doing? And secondly, if you regulate drugs in a legal market, you'll have to take into consideration, for instance, the competition laws is bordering on perverse when drug cartels can come to the government and say that we demand to sell our drugs in a free competition because our international competition laws actually dictate that if you open for a legal market.
Mm.
So there are a lot of looking for the word here, complications at least, yes, before we come to where you want to come. I will not rule it out, but there are definitely speed bumps there.
Yeah, definitely. I love the question about organised crime because there can be nothing perhaps more important from a policing and prosecuting point of view than to put all the resources into beating organised crime. You're right. It's a scourge on society. You can have much more success against organised crime if you level the playing fields. You level the playing fields by taking their money away from them. Now, I'll refer you to a couple of documents from the National Crime Agency in the UK, which is a national organisation, bit like sort of like FBI type of thing, if you've not heard of them, and they deal with a serious and organised crime across borders. They published their strategic assessment into organised crime over the last 2 years, last September and the September before. And in those documents, they conceded various points that we have been advocating at Leap UK for some time. The first is the fact that the organised crime groups in the major cities are monopolising and moving to take over the supply from the county towns and seaside towns. And that's a direct quote from the strategic assessment. But another very, very important concession that the National Crime Agency made is that the finances, the profits from the illicit drug trade are reinvested into other forms of criminality. Now, we've probably all heard the sort of classic phrase that you need money to make money. Well, that is where the funding for other forms of criminality goes. The illicit drug trade forms the framework for all other kinds of organised criminality, all of it. It provides the connections, it provides the financing, and that includes people trafficking and weapons and things like that. So if you remove the financial power of the illicit drugs trade, and I should emphasise again that the kind of corruption that I'm talking about is absolutely only possible with the finances specifically from the drug trade. If you look at those reports where they estimate a breakdown of the amount of money which comes from each level of criminality, the biggest chunk, there's no great surprise, is drugs. The next biggest chunk, which is almost rivaling the amount of money which comes from drugs, is that by organised fraud. And the rest is broken down into much smaller chunks like people trafficking, those kind of things. They're a really tiny part of the overall amount of money. So by far the biggest amount is from the drugs trade. For the other types of the fraud type of things, they are invested in from the money from the illicit drugs trade. So, for example, you want a computer nerd, then you pay for them with the money from the drugs trade. So if you want to seriously fight organised crime, you have to take the money away from them, because the money they are using to corrupt the system, which is like trying to fight them with one hand behind your back. If you want to fight the other things that organised crime do, you want to take away the money that they invest into it, again, by regulating the drugs trade. But as one last point I would make to counter that is that you mentioned guns. Now, it's no great shock to say that the reason that gangsters want guns is because to protect their drug trade. Most criminality in terms of the use of firearms for drugs, certainly in Europe, it'd be difficult to prove in the context of the United States, but certainly in Europe, the guns go hand in hand with the drugs trade. Because it's the Wild West out there, and everyone wants to be the person making the most amount of money. That's why you get gangs shooting each other and fighting over territory. Gangs will fall out over who supplies drugs in a prison, or who supplies drugs in a certain city or a certain place. That's why the guns are needed. So if you take away and regulate the drugs trade, you don't have the same demand for firearms, because brewery bosses don't have shootouts, do they? Not for a long time, not since early 1930s America of brewery bosses, or, well, in fact, they didn't have beer because you were stuck with spirits because beer was too expensive to transport. So you don't have the same violence, you don't have the same motivation for violence, you don't have the same networks for it. Now, yeah, I mean, you mentioned there's problems. Yeah, there's going to be legislative problems. Yeah, of course there is. There's going to be huge problems. I mean, the biggest problem is the fact that if you really want to beat organised crime, you've got to do it on a worldwide, global level. So, yeah, there's massive difficulties in it. So that's why you start with small policy chunks. It's why you start to eat away at it with innovations, small innovations, like heroin prescription, like Canada's doing with cannabis. You know, the Liberal Party in Canada campaigned as one of their major campaign points that they were going to regulate cannabis. And they did it with the same messages that we use in Leap UK, that this is actually a child protection issue. We should be protecting our children from this. And as soon as you start talking to people in those terms and explain, because that's what it is, as soon as you start explaining that this is to protect our kids, then you start winning people over. And then you start to find the solutions to the problems. Yeah, the monopoly thing that you talk about, that sounds sort of, even if it's a constitutional law, you just deal with it. Because this is what we need to do. And I would say it's urgent, because people are dying, and they don't have to die. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your second point.
You answered it.
Did I? All right. Okay. Anyone else? There's another one there, and then I'm sure you've got another one as well. Sure you have.
I had a comment to this, that the drug trade is so connected to the arms and other trades. And I actually think that the amount of drugs on the earth is increased because of the prohibition. Because if you look down at Afghanistan, then you see the war going on there, and you see that they increase the opium production for war reasons, to buy and sell weapons. The market here, the prices, the prohibition makes the prices go up, so it's part of it. So I think if we made these drugs illegal, we would take them away from this. It wouldn't be possible for the Taliban to buy weapons for opium money. So it would, or all the other side, both sides, I think, is involved in the drug traffics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't matter.
I think legalizing will actually make less drugs on earth, because you take the drugs away from the arms and trade.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether it's gangsters in Europe, whether it's paramilitaries like the FARC rebels in Colombia, or whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan. You find that actually the only reason people can afford guns is because of the drugs. That's what makes the guns affordable. But I wouldn't agree that the drugs have got more expensive because of prohibition, because actually, since we banned drugs, it's 1971 in the UK, but what year it was here. Since we've banned drugs, they've got cheaper, stronger, and more varied. Well, yeah, but it doesn't matter what the drug is. It doesn't matter what it is, because there's always competition to provide the best product. There's always competition to provide the strongest product. So, and you know, in 1993, I was paying £10 for 0.2 of a gram of heroin. In 1993, when I stopped working undercover, I was paying £10 for 0.2 of a gram of heroin, and the purity had gone up. Now, what product is there that's that inflation-proof? I should have think what a pint of beer was in 1993 in the UK, but so prohibition is not impacting much on the market really, but the profits have gone up.
They say for some here in Bergen that the stuff is more expensive and more other mixed with things because the laws here are more strict.
Don't believe it. Don't believe it. The drugs have got stronger everywhere. I've seen the evidence from so many different countries that Norway is not a special case. Norway is not tackling the drug problem and any better than any other Western country. Of that I can be sure.
Da har vi plass til ett spørsmål til.
There's this book called How to Sell Cocaine and Get Away with It. I know it sounds very but it's a documentary book that basically explains that the cocaine market is so significant that removing it would cause an economic collapse. Like it goes in the billions and billions in the US that it would just destroy the market because it's so in the system. But that's not my question. That's just there are also lots of significant figures who are in the drug market. Even in Norway, we had a case where they were about to be caught, and then, no offense, the police said, "Don't take them," because they were too significant. So, my question is: do you think the economy is just not ready for it? That if the whole world starts changing over to a more regulated drug market, even with taxation, that it would maybe cause economic problems, and that's why the top leaders are not making that change? They've seen that the studies couldn't, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, I get your meaning. It's a really interesting question, actually. The economics of the drug trade is absolutely fascinating. I don't believe that that's the reason why politicians are resisting change. I think politicians have been trapped by a moralist narrative, which is led and maintained by media and various people. It dates back a long time. But as for the actual trade, well, it's a theoretical question because there's no way you could get rid of the illicit trade without regulating it. And I'll just give you an interesting fact. For the cocaine trade, sometimes the National Crime Agency in the UK will have a massive cocaine seizure. Maybe the Royal Navy will catch a boat, or they'll catch someone landing it on a beach or something, and they'll take great photographs of it, and I call it photo-op policing. And they take these lovely photographs, and there's big masses of cocaine. It looks like sort of hay bales. It's all very impressive, and all the police want to be photographed next to it, and it's all very exciting, and the newspapers are involved. But what the National Crime Agency actually should say, if they were being honest, is that even according to their own intelligence, there's never more than 1% recovered that's imported into the UK. Never more than 1%, which I'd call that pretty good business losses. Marks and Spencer's, which is a high street shop in the UK, write off 5% of normal business losses just from shoplifting. Yeah. So 1% is not bad business losses, really. Now, so you can't make a dent in, even by making peace with the FARC rebels, you cannot make a dent in the cocaine market unless you regulate it. But in an ideal world, you would regulate it, and then you would see a steady decline of use, like you've seen a steady decline of use with smoking cigarettes. But it will be a safer world where those people who do want to have their cocaine can get it from a pharmacist, somewhere where they know what's in it. Because actually, all of the cutting agents in cocaine are far more dangerous than cocaine. There's carcinogens in there, there's all sorts of really nasty chemicals in there. So in an ideal world, you want to shrink that market anyway. And if that causes economic problems, well, that's a reasonable trade as far as I'm concerned. But actually, I think it would create an enormous boost by regulating all of the drug markets, especially the cannabis market. I mean, I don't use this in advocacy. I don't use this as a reason to do it, because for me, you can't sell that to people. You can't say, oh, we could make money from it, because we're talking about the safety of children and society. You can't break it down just to money. You can't break that down to monetary reasons. I don't think that's right. But it is a reasonable argument to make. It's a reasonable thing to point out that actually there would be enormous financial benefit. From what I've read about the economics of the drug trade, it would be in healthier, the finances would be in the hands of healthier individuals, nicer individuals, put it that way.
Okay, that was the end. You can read his brilliant book, Cod Cop Bad War. You can get it on Amazon. It's cheap on Kindle. A big applause.
Thank you.